Hi.
Hello,
Hello, everybody.
Welcome to San Francisco.
Thank you very much. Thank you, San Francisco, and to the JCC for having us here.
All right. You heard that KALW is the only station here that airs The Daily.
The only station.
The only station.
Yeah. Thank you to
KALW.
To KALW. Yeah.
I got it. Okay, so I want to go back in time. I've always wondered.
First of all, can I just say,
Sure.
It is an honor to be on stage with a living legend like you. I couldn't be prouder to be here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry for interrupting. Hosts have a hard time with this thing.
Yeah, so journalists, I always ask this question of journalists. Like, when you were a kid, were you the one that's asking all the questions and just like, you had a question about everything, you had to know everything? Or, this is another kind, were you the quiet, thoughtful type who always wondered about stuff but didn't talk about it?
Not the quiet kind. No. I developed a pretty obsessive relationship with the news from a pretty young age. I was a newspaper carrier. I started delivering the newspaper in middle school. I grew up in North Haven, Connecticut, which is a little bit north of New Haven.
Like, well, two. Yeah.
Yeah. 2 or 3 loud people in this audience. So I grew up just outside New Haven, and the local paper was the New Haven Register. And I had a friend who delivered the paper, and his friend moved away, and I became his partner delivering the paper out. Eventually he moved away, and my sister joined me in doing the paper route. There's a ton of turnover in the local newspaper carrier market. And my sister Tracy and I delivered the newspaper 7 days a week, and our parents would help us out. They'd take the family Subaru and open up the hatch, and that was the Sunday newspaper delivery system in particular, because it's really heavy. And you don't just fit that in your satchel. You have to, do it with a car. And it was the ritual of making the paper, especially on Sunday, and delivering the paper every day at 5:50 in the morning, which is when we got up.
How old were you?
I was probably 13.
5:50 in the
Yeah, every morning, 5:50. And so when you're up at 5:50 in the morning, you might as well read the newspaper. And there was also, I don't know if you guys, if you've ever delivered newspapers, and maybe only a few of you have, but there is an almost religious quality to breaking open the plastic seal, which I can still do to this day. You gotta lift it up, pull it back, tear it out, and there you have the first copies of the newspaper. It smells a certain way, feels a certain way.
Yeah.
And on big news days, I can remember, I think it was the first Gulf War, I was delivering the newspaper that day, and like, it feels noble and purposeful. And the other thing that happened, and I really do think this helped me become a good journalist, if I can be proud, is that on Sundays you had to go get people to pay for the paper. And you had to go up to their doors, knock on it, have conversations with them, learn to interact with people much older than I was or my sister was, and develop relationships with them. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is how I became a good source reporter for the New York Times 25 years later, but I really liked talking to people. And before long, I was weeding their lawns. There was one customer I had on the newspaper. God, this is all just rushing to me. Suddenly, we were in her car driving to her husband's grave site because she'd hired me to help clear the weeds and replant the flowers. And I felt very connected to my community. I felt very connected to the news. And I'm really glad that my neighbor moved away. And I had that opportunity because it was an incredibly pivotal little moment in my young life.
And you went on to the high school newspaper.
And to the New Haven Register itself, and to be a intern one summer at that newspaper, and a couple other smaller newspapers, and my high school newspaper, and my friend Ross Douthat, who many of you may know as a columnist for the New York Times, and you might not always agree with him, but you might. He and I, So is this the time I should tell you that I was the best man at Ross's wedding? So Ross and I, we have always come from very different, kind of perspectives on things. But he and I were best friends in high school, and we simultaneously ran the official high school newspaper at our little private school.
Why do you say official like that?
Because I'm about to explain why the whole thing was incredibly treacherous. Because then we created an underground newspaper as well. And we would instigate these like newspaper wars between the two of them that we had complete control over, right? So like.
And you were doing both newspapers? You were reporting in both newspapers?
Well, one was anonymous. It was an anonymous underground. And so they would, they'd trade barbs. Like the Advent, is completely wrong about this. And La Verite, which was the elevated name of the underground newspaper, would fire shots at the Advent and back and forth. And
it's like a video game.
It was extremely unethical. But we had a really good time.
So, where do you even go with that? Yeah, I mean, this idea of going, then you become a print journalist, obviously. I want to get into going from a print journalist to audio journalism. Because at some point, we get bitten by the radio/audio bug and the love for just like listening and audio. When did that happen for you?
Well, let me tell you when it didn't happen, because I had no relationship to audio up until
nobody listened to
2016.
NPR at home, the radio. You didn't have the radio house?
Not
where
really.
People turned on the radio?
No, we were a newspaper house, and we were a cable news house. And so I didn't listen to public radio. And when people ask me about the rich relationship they assume I have with audio and podcasting, I have to be honest and say that until I hosted a podcast, I had listened to maybe 3 or 4 episodes of This American Life. And now some people on the Daily would tell you that's why I have this very distinctive way of talking and sounding that doesn't sound like Ira Glass. And they would say that everybody else sounded like Ira Glass. And I didn't have that problem because I didn't know what Ira Glass really sounded like. But so I had not much of a relationship with audio when the New York Times went out and decided in a really serious way, just by coincidence, in the last 3 months of the 2016 presidential campaign, to ambitiously decide to create an audio department. And what did that even mean, right? We are the New York Times. We are not an audio operation. Arguably, we don't even have much business being in audio. The only thing we had done in audio until then was a smattering of podcasts that did not have a huge audience. I mean, the Times approach to audio was very rudimentary. There was once a podcast called The Front Page, and one of my colleagues just read the front page into a microphone, right? I mean, that was part of the
basic.
problem. We didn't understand the medium all that well, but they went and hired somebody who was really savvy from WBUR in Boston, a great station. And she came in, her name is Lisa Tobin, and she set out to answer the question that was her assignment, which is what should the New York Times sound like? And the answer obviously was me. No, it wasn't. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, it was, but...
So,
but did they just approach you? Did you say, no, I've always wanted to
this is a funny story.
Do audio?
So I got a call from the political editor back up. My dear friend, Nick Confessori, for those of you who ever watch Morning Joe, very smart, handsome fellow on the TV a lot, and a Times investigative and political reporter, he gets a call from the political editor of the Times saying, Nick, we want you to think about hosting a campaign podcast for 3 months to the end of the election. And he said no, and then he called me and he said, I think you're gonna be next on the call list. I think because just something in the conversation led him to believe that I was gonna be the next call. So I get this call, it's next, and they say, this is classic, New York Times bureaucracy, song and dance. Michael, you're the first person we thought of for the show. you just seem ideal for it. And I went along with it. I said I was reaching a point in my career as a print journalist. I'd been at the Times for about 12 years at that point, where I sensed this was my last 4-year cycle of traveling to Iowa and New Hampshire and being a political reporter. I was ready for something else. And audio kind of just, in that moment, in that phone call, audio walked into my life. And I said yes, and they promised me what felt like a risk-free approach to this. And I mean that in all seriousness. They said you can still be a campaign reporter, because this podcast, it will just take up a little bit of your time. And it'll be like 20% of your time. Now, you know this because you've been in the business forever, that there's no such thing as a part-time podcast. I mean, you could make one podcast a month, and it would take up an enormous amount of your time, but we were doing it twice a week. So it began to...
This is the run-up.
The run-up. Many of you may not know about the run-up. It was the daily in kind of prototype form, and it contained many of the seeds of the show. We were cultivating a set of reporters to come on the show and talk about their work and tell stories and deliver big ideas, never just the news of the day, but somehow finding something really unexpected in a story.
And they tell you to come and host this show, and you're thinking, like this idea of also when you transition from print to audio. At KLW, we have our KLW Audio Academy, where we
that sounds nice.
We take folks and we train them wherever they're coming from, and we turn them into radio journalists. And one big thing is writing for radio, which is a totally different process than print writing, right? And so did you have to go into like some kind of intensive training, or just to learn how to write for this new medium?
No, I had no idea what I was doing. And I had no, I say this sincerely, nothing would have led anyone to believe I should be an audio host. And I stumbled into it, and I had no idea what I was doing, and we had some really long, nightmarish sessions of trying to figure out, what was I going to sound like. If you go back and listen to those shows, you will notice, if you're a daily listener in particular, that my voice was much higher, because I did not have what the producers call gravitas. I did not know how to like summon this part of, you probably know what it's all about, but I have discovered it in the last few years. But I did have this weird style of talking that you have when you're a print reporter, which is you say a lot, and you give people feedback because you don't want them to think you've like, walked away from the phone to get a cup of coffee. And so I kept all those quirks of being a print reporter in audio. And I also did learn some things. I mean, along the way, producers gave me the kind of wisdom that only comes through time. Like, if you don't laugh at someone's joke, the audience doesn't know to laugh either. And so the host has to laugh. And so I learned to laugh along, and to be spontaneous, and to not, for the first couple weeks of the show, I didn't understand the role of a host at all. So am I supposed to say something now? Or like, am I supposed to interrupt? What's the flow of it?
So you were
How
really
much is this me? How much is this you?
into this thing.
Yeah,
and
so the run-up was a good runway.
Training grounds.
Yes.
And then when the Daily came along, well, first of all, do you think they tapped you for that because you had already reported on a certain candidate for a very long time? You were covering a lot of Trump's business.
I was investigating
news.
Donald Trump's life.
Right. Do you think that was part of the reason why?
I don't know. I mean, you have to remember what the famous ticker was telling everybody at the New York Times and everybody who read the Times. And the first episode of the run-up was called Landslide. And I don't have to tell you which way the data was telling us the landslide was going to go. Boy, we look back at that episode title, and it's just like, what? Like, it's emblematic of so many things that I now regret about the way that I covered the 2016 race. And I don't think it was about the candidate I was covering, because I was, in a sense, covering the other candidate, and we can talk about that a little bit more as well, because all the way up to election night, it definitely felt like, my role was getting more and more diminished because the Hillary Clinton team was revving up more and more to the final moments of the election.
So what was election night for you like?
What was election night like for me? Well, I'll tell you.
Because
I'll
you
tell
knew,
you.
well, oh yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, it's a kind of a fascinating story. So my job that night was to do nothing, pretty much. I remember getting really dressed up because I was going to go on stage at the Times Center, which is downstairs. It's an event space, and we were going to entertain a bunch of people who'd come to watch the election results and give them live results and analysis and talk about the election. And the Hillary Clinton reporters were upstairs writing the story that was going to be the history-making story. I mean, if you guys didn't know this, there was a headline picked out for that next day's paper, Madam President. There was a, I mean, and this was, and I think I want to be really clear. This was all done quite responsibly and journalistically. There was a Trump story. It was just it was short.
That's what you wrote.
Well, I'll explain what happened because it's a little bit of a mess. But the Clinton story was long, and there was a package of stories, and those reporters were really, really busy all night, and we were downstairs entertaining people in the audience, and around 9:30 p.m., this same editor who tapped me to be the host of the run-up turned to me and said, Michael, I want you to go into a room and write the Trump win story. And I went into a room with a colleague of mine, his name is Matt Flegenheimer, and we didn't emerge for 5 more hours. And we turned this nub of a story, about 400, 500 words, into a 1,700-word story that would run under the Trump triumphs headline the next day. And that night was so hectic that when the paper came out the next day under this history-making banner, Trump triumphs, the bylines on that story that Matt and I wrote were the wrong bylines. They were the bylines of the 2 reporters who were to have written the Hillary story. And so I pretended for about 24 hours that I was okay with this and that my ego could handle this. And then I wrote an email to some people and I said, could you just make me 1 or 2 copies of the paper that have the right bylines on it? And they did that.
Just so I could have it.
But that night was extraordinary. And it was a lot of lessons, for us as an organization.
As someone who did, cover Trump for so long, what feelings did you have attached to that? You knew a lot about him. You were covering him for a long time. You knew about his relationships with women. You knew about,
I'd interviewed several women who said they had been, sexually assaulted by him.
Right. So I meant, you must have had a specific kind of shock. All the rest of us were shocked, but because of what you knew, did it take a while for you?
I think the feeling I had was a combination of genuine surprise. It was unexpected, followed by a pang of regret and kind of professional soul searching over what does it mean to think you're at the top of your game at the New York Times and to have not understood the country that you report on. And it was brutal. It was really hard. I mean, I went home that night and I asked my partner if, what should I do now? Should I go to Washington? Should I cover this presidency? And a lot of us were having, really honest conversations about what just happened here, and it's shortly thereafter that we create The Daily.
Whew, all right, so who wants to go behind the scenes of The Daily right now? Yes? Yes? Okay, so we get to The Daily.
Yeah.
Day one. First of all, can we talk about voice?
Sure.
Let's talk about voice. I love teaching narration and voicing, and I wonder, how did you, land on your delivery style?
Of the show or of the host?
Of hosting The Daily. Your delivery style, your style of speaking in the podcast is not like this.
Interesting. Do you mean the start, today?
The whole thing.
Because that.
Look at that.
There's two things going on in The Daily, right? There's the stuff at the top, and the stuff at the bottom, and then there's stuff going on in the middle, which I think is a little more like me, but is also a little more formal.
Right. But okay, let's talk about, so the top is that, where did that come from? Kind of that.
That?
Yeah.
I don't know what that is sometimes.
You know?
I mean, I love it, and I think it's essential to the show.
Like, did somebody direct you, or did
Yeah.
you just like say, this is what I'm gonna do?
Yeah, we came to the formulation that every day we wanted to begin the daily, well, first of all, with that incredible theme music, which I think if you listen carefully, and I highly recommend you do, has in it these incredible sounds that I call kind of the siren, that I think they really are, it is music built 3 weeks after this election. Like, you have to understand we were all in a moment and we were trying to figure it out. And if you listen really carefully, the last sound you will hear of the theme music, and it goes da-da-da, da-da-da, it's the musicians who created it call it kind of an open question mark that never gets answered. And I think that that really represents something fundamental about the show. The top of the show was always meant to be, you know, a little bit of a cheeky kind of formal thing. Here we are, you know, we're about to enter a show that's pretty conversational, that often has a lot of informality in the interactions I have with my colleagues, or even with a senator. You know, I'm in Senator Chuck Schumer's office, he's building a fire, I'm commenting on how he's building the fire, you're hearing that. But the beginning of the show is a little bit of a throwback to the kind of old 6:30 news billboards of, you know, Peter Jennings or Tom Brokaw, and yet often has a kind of a complicated wordplay in it, or it's a little bit of a tease. And that delivery just was, you know, my interpretation of that old ritual. But then it's often this very kind of jarring transition into whatever
Conversational.
Yeah, whatever surprise meal we have, you know, whipped up for you.
Okay. Because we were talking about this backstage, the idea of being a news person, delivering the news, and, you know, that delivery has changed over the decades, over the years, from that very kind of formal delivery to being, you know, conversational and more relaxed. But then, you know, just like this worry sometimes that I have when I'm doing my podcast versus doing the news program, which, if you've heard The Stoop, it is very conversational. You know, me and my colleague Leela Day, we just like, you know, girl, this and that and this and that. And, you know, there's this, will people still take me seriously as a news person when I'm, you know, also doing my conversational sides? And you've managed to kind of, you know, do both within the same half hour or 25 minutes.
Yeah.
How do you decide what stories you are going to do? What is that process like? You don't do the headline news, right? You know, that's not the story that you dig into, but you dig into the story that people are thinking about. How do you determine what stories to cover?
So we are a New York Times podcast, so we basically have this like vast buffet of stories and reporters to grab from. And we begin in the morning alongside the whole news operation as these meetings are occurring where people are discussing what the news of the day is. And we sit down around 10 o'clock in a room full of, it was once 4 people, now it's closer to 15 to 20 people. And we just start hashing through the news. And over time, it's gotten more and more clear to us what a daily episode is and what it isn't. A daily episode, almost by definition, has to be a story that can somehow sustain you for 20 minutes, and us for 20 minutes, and the person we're talking to for 20 minutes. So by definition, it has to have a narrative to it. It has to be a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. That's number one. Number two, it has to have some sort of big idea in it. You know, the president tweeted. That's not going to cut it. You know, like, by definition, so many stories walk out the door when you ask yourself, is there a big idea to be kind of teased out here? And the third thing we're looking for in a story is a character. You know, some dramatic action that occurs to someone, whether it's the journalist or a character in the story, or the president of Turkey, and we're gonna take that journey with them. And so once you factor in those 3 things, which we generally like to have for every story we do, then there are only a couple stories every day you really want to tackle. And so, just to take this week, we have on the daily been thinking about vaping for months. How do we tell the story of vaping? How do we tell the story of a bunch of people getting sick, but there being a lot of confusion over it? And because we're at the Times, one of our colleagues found the family of a man who is a very rare case of a man being diagnosed as a death from e-cigarettes, from vaping. And she had gone and interviewed the family and recorded everything. One of the great things about the Daily is that it unlocked this reality that reporters go to places and they record things. And in the past, I can't even imagine the thousands, if not millions of hours of lost New York Times journalism that's sitting on recorders prior to the Daily using it. And now we just say to people, your iPhone is your sword and your shield, and just go into battle and just send us the file back at the end of the day. And with the exception of a few cases where a dog is barking really loudly or somebody laid the iPhone in a really poor position, it generally yields extraordinarily intimate access to people. And that, for example, was a classic case. We were able to tell the story of vaping through one family, one character, and all the inevitable human drama that occurred around him.
And, speaking of telling the story, you've said this thing that, really resonates with me. And another great podcast called Throughline does this as well,
Yep.
Throughline from NPR. Where you say one of the big problems today with media is starting the story in the middle, giving me the story from the middle. Well, what led up to this, right? And
Yes.
this idea of the backstory, and like nothing happens in a vacuum. Well, what happened before? Why is this important? What does it do?
Well, I think as a print journalist, I was guilty of this for a long time too. You're often rewarded for advancing a news story to some new place and beginning the story with that information. So you might break the news that something is happening inside a presidential campaign, or that there is a major change in US military strategy in the Middle East. And you begin with that information and you start putting a little bit of context, but then you get back to the news, and then there's a quote, and then there's another quote. And I think that has been the form of newspaper journalism in particular for generations.
Even in radio, the idea
Yeah.
move forward. What's
Yes,
next?
what's next?
What's next?
When we started
Not
the Daily,
what happened before.
Right. When we started the Daily, we had a series of conversations with ourselves in which we said, where does the story really want to start? What was so liberating about creating a daily podcast at the New York Times that we thought we had no idea if anyone was going to listen, and because all these people had come from public radio and were suddenly married to the Times, we had no obligations to any customs or rituals. We were starting a brand new thing, and the stakes were reasonably low. If the Daily didn't succeed, I would go back to writing. Obviously it wouldn't have been good, but we experimented a ton. And one of the things we experimented with was the idea that we would never start a story in a way the way newspapers start stories, in the middle of the story, and that we would begin a story where it really wants to start. We would ask stupid questions without making people feel stupid. We did an episode about NATO in which we just let David Sanger, my colleagues, just really explain what the hell is NATO. I happen to be a little obsessed with European history, so I know what NATO is, but a lot of people they're busy, they don't remember what they learned in AP US history, and they need a primer that doesn't make them feel like it's being shoved in their face that they forgot it. It can be tucked into the story, but it has to be there. And we're really proud of the fact that people who give us feedback on the show say, you really give us the whole story. You really start the story. You cannot tell the story of the Middle East now, period, without going back to the role of the great powers and how they divided it up. To tell the story of the Kurds and Turkey and Syria is to have to understand the story of the Kurds that goes back a really long way, so that you can possibly understand why Erdogan regards them as terrorists and the US regards them as allies. And so we never want to start with that kind of casual set of references, which I hate in the news. because it makes me feel stupid, and I don't think I'm stupid. So I don't think you guys, want to feel that way either. So that was a really good decision.
Yeah. You also said once that your mission was to change the relationship of the news consumer to the news presenter.
Well,
what does that mean?
What a highfalutin phrase that is. Yeah. I mean, what I think I meant by that is go back to the 2016 election. I think that was a moment where, faith in the news industry eroded, for sure. But it had been eroding for some time. There's an incredible statistic out there.
Because we didn't predict it? Because we didn't report
I think there are subsets of disappointment all over the place. There are people who don't trust the mainstream media because they have been told by their favorite anchor of their favorite cable news show that the mainstream media shouldn't be trusted. There are people who don't trust the news because they've had some experience with it, where they felt like they entrusted someone with a story, or someone around them entrusted them with a story, and the story wasn't delivered with as much nuance and accuracy as they hoped it would be. There are people who were disappointed in the New York Times because of what happened with the whole coverage. And
you can't say it.
I forgot the word.
Meter?
Yeah. And so when we created The Daily, we kind of had that trust issue in mind. And I think the way that journalists can fix the trust deficit is to be much more transparent about how it is we gather news. And that doesn't necessarily mean pausing the interview to say, now how did you get that piece of information? But it's building into the interview and into the storytelling the journalist as a character who is off reporting, describing their journey. I mean, we did an episode maybe a week and a half ago, 3 weeks ago, with Julian Barnes, who's a national security reporter, in which he went into a neighborhood in Virginia to try to report on this guy who was a Russian spy who was being exfiltrated into the US. And Julian's knocking on doors and talking to neighbors and asking, how did you not know you have this huge spy next door? And the neighbors are like shutting their doors on them, or like 10 reporters are rushing the mailman to figure out what the mailman knows, and he's like, oh, that's it, I'm out of here. But in any event, you suddenly know that Julian Barnes is like, he gets up, he gets into he rented this very dopey little car, which he turned into a part of the episode. It was like one of these little rental vehicles he wasn't sure could make it on the highway. And it's not that this is making every journalist heroic, but it's making them relatable. And it's making them people who you can see into their process. And I think that is a very big step towards making people understand what it is we're up to. Because the old byline and the old kind of way that we present to the news as if it was this kind of set of tablets that we hand to you and we hope you like them and that you're grateful for them, it doesn't leave you with a whole lot of understanding of how we got there. And I think that The Daily is part of the way that we show you our process.
Putting a human face?
A human face, a human voice, humor, yeah, all that.
Like turning the reporter into somebody that's like the guy next door that you will believe because he's your neighbor?
I think that's right. Or because you have come to get to know them through multiple conversations. Mike Schmidt is one of our treasured colleagues, if you listen to The Daily, and we have had some wild adventures with him, and by now you kind of know the way this guy thinks and how he processes the news. And I imagine, I hope that you have the same relationship we do to him, which is trust and respect, because he has broken so many stories and come on. I mean, this is the reporter who broke the James Comey memos, the James Comey dinner with Donald Trump, the Hillary Clinton email server story, whatever you think of all those stories. And he's a bipartisan scooper artist. We once interviewed him from inside a Kinko's because that was the only place he could find a landline. And you could hear him humorously borrowing the phone from the employee at the Kinko's. And that was all contained in the episode. Mm-hmm. I think it's very hard to regard somebody you've gotten to know like that as the enemy of the people.
Speaking of that, I'm a journalist. Lots of I think journalists in this room as well. I see some folks. But, we've been called the enemy of the people, all of us, just like all of us.
Wow, that was that seamless a transition?
But it was. It literally, question number 12 right here. But Trump has a special place in his heart for the New York Times. And I'm just wondering how you see this animosity that's been just like hurled upon your organization, and does it distract you sometimes? Does it get to you? What do you do?
I have to start
Is it too much?
I have to start with a couple stories about Donald Trump and the New York Times. No, because they're interesting.
Do we have to talk about
just
him?
one?
Okay,
just one.
Go ahead.
Just one story. So I once found myself inside the New York Public Library's New York Times archive for some research I was doing about Donald Trump writes a lot of letters to people, especially these kind of like, Sharpie over the newspaper kind of thing. And I was writing a story about his, how he's actually to know Donald Trump is to know that he likes to send people like real letters. He doesn't type, he doesn't have a computer. And so we compiled a lot of these letters, as many as possible, for a story I wrote. And I went to the New York Times archive to find his correspondence with executive editors of the New York Times. And you should see how fawning these letters are. I mean, thank you for this wonderful dinner we had. You're a national treasure. I cannot wait to speak with you again. I hope your wife is well. I mean, Donald Trump's relationship with the New York Times is as complicated as any great love affair could ever possibly be. And I say that not just from these letters, but from my own interactions with him. I mean, I remember calling him once just to get a quote for some story, and if you called Donald Trump, 10 years ago from the New York Times, it just went straight through to his hands.
Wow.
And he was so glad to get a call from the Times. Up until the middle of the presidential campaign, when I called him and said, I want to write about your relationship to Twitter, 2 hours later, I was in his office on the 26th floor of Trump Tower with him taking out his phone and scrolling, through Twitter to talk about how excited he was by all the, the retweets he was getting.
That's access.
It's access, yes. Well, it was, remember, we didn't even know he was going to win the Republican primary at that point. But he's very fond of the New York Times, and I think as coverage has gotten more skeptical, more aggressive, more accountable to him, it's been really, really hard for him. And, obviously it just ended with this. It didn't end. It just advanced to this place where he says he's canceling all the subscriptions from the Times. But this may be the one place where it might be worth playing some audio from the Daily, because so the relationship the Times has with the president and this language he uses is, on one level, you get used to it as a journalist. But when you're somebody who runs the New York Times and is thinking about the kind of grander scale of what it means for journalism, like our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, the president's language has actually become what he regards as a threat to journalism. And so we did an episode of The Daily, harkening back to this issue of transparency. How do you open up our process? How do you let people understand what it's really like to be a journalist, to be in the room with President Trump, where we recorded our publisher in the Oval Office with President Trump. I should give you just a little bit of a backstory here. A.G. Sulzberger, our publisher, went to meet with the president. It was supposed to be off the record. A.G. Sulzberger delivered a stern warning to the president in which he said, these words you use, enemy of the people, fake news, they are presenting a real danger to journalists. The president broke that off-the-record agreement and mischaracterized the conversation on Twitter. And then that forced the publisher to have to explain what was going on. Trump invites him back to the Oval Office, and AG says, no, we're not going to do that again. So he says, I'm going to bring 2 reporters from the Times. And if we can play this clip, this is the publisher sternly warning the president and talking to us about
the concern I raised then was about your anti-press rhetoric, fake news, enemy of the people. And at the time I said, I was concerned that it wasn't just divisive, it was potentially dangerous, and warned that I thought it could have consequences. I feel like in the time since we've started to see some of those consequences play out, we've seen around the world an unprecedented rise in attacks on journalists, threats to journalists.
And he's, as I'm saying this, he is leaning in and asking questions.
Jailing of journalists and murders of
Where
journalists.
in particular?
Globally, on every continent. I'm happy to send you some of the literature. It's very closely tracked. But one of the things that's been really striking to me is, as I've talked to my colleagues around the globe, working in different countries, particularly working in countries where a free press is already a tenuous thing, they say that they are increasingly of the belief that your rhetoric is creating a climate in which dictators and tyrants are able to employ your words and in suppressing a free press. And I wanted to.
To his credit, he heard me out and he listened to it.
I'd urge you to reconsider these attacks.
I understand that.
But if you choose not to, I want you to be aware of some of the consequences that I'm starting to see out there.
Would you say more so now than over the last 5 years?
Yes.
Right now? I mean,
Yes.
more so now than even a year ago.
Yes, and I think that
I'm not happy
the
to
murder
hear
of Khashoggi is,
I don't know if you guys
just the
could hear
highest.
the last thing that President Trump said to A.G. Sulzberger. He said, "I'm not happy to hear that his rhetoric." So I think, that was for us, the most meta version possible of the thing that I think we do and that is really important about The Daily is, that is the stuff of, secret conversations that the idea that would even be the source of a story in the old school, the publisher meets with the president, that is so off the record. And I give A.G. Sulzberger a ton of credit. When he walked out of that room, he blessed the concept of us using the audio. He came on the show to talk about it. And you got this extraordinary glimpse into this exchange. I think he was incredibly courageous for the second time to tell the president in very uncomfortable terms the danger it was creating. But then also you hear the president responding in this kind of complicated way that he often does, which is he'll respond to somebody in front of him one way. And then, do I have to tell you what happened 3 weeks later? He goes on Twitter and says the New York Times is the enemy of the people. And he's done it several more times. And here he was, and I believe he felt probably earnestly responding to the publisher of the Times saying that you are presenting a real danger to working journalists around the world. And does he retain it all those weeks later? It's just hard to know what's happening there, but we were so proud of that episode because it felt like the embodiment of what it is The Daily does.
I want to stay on that just for a minute.
Yeah.
This idea of, we are scared. We are afraid. I am afraid as a journalist. I've had family call me from overseas and say, "Can you stop what you're doing?" And for journalists of color, I'm at so many intersections, right? I'm a journalist. I'm a woman. I'm African. African from Sudan, one of the countries that we're on I'm almost so 5 things that Trump hates, I am, in one person, just magically. And it feels like, big press or, Washington Post, the New York Times. To me, it feels like they're more protected.
That's
in a
interesting.
way. Do you feel that?
More shielded from the kind of personal pain of this.
I do. I have this feeling that maybe it is because of the station, right, of the New York Times. Do you feel that? Do you feel like, have you feared for your life so far? Have you feared for yourself? Have you felt, because this is like a barrage and it's been going on and on and on and it hasn't stopped and people have died and journalists have been killed. What about you and the New York Times? What are you feeling?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry that has happened to you, because this is, none of us got into this industry ever thinking we were going to be conducting this work that we're so proud of and that we think is so important to our civic discourse and to our democracy in this kind of climate. So it's really hard. I want to be honest and say I have not felt those things. I was not a Trump beat reporter who went to the rallies and had those crowds kind of turn on the media section of the audience and say or do some crude things. So that wasn't my experience. I did have the president, tweet that I should resign from the Times when I was investigating his personal life and his relationship with women. So I know I have a little bit of a feel for what that's like. My colleague Maggie Haberman has had some, some fraught experiences on social media, but we have the protection of a major news operation and a publisher who approaches this, the way he does, with a great deal of fortitude. But the people my heart goes out to the most are people at smaller news organizations who are trying to do enterprising journalism and are operating in a climate where to some in the country, everybody is the enemy of the people, or is fake news, and that rhetoric, I think we all fear could lead to someone taking an action that could be really, really dangerous. I mean, I've worked at the New York Times for 15 years now, and the amount of security that we have introduced to our building is pretty significant. And that is I'm not a security expert, so I don't want to attribute all these things, but the climate has changed, and we have something to fear.
We don't have a whole lot of time left, but this last question, you told me that you feel like The Daily has changed the New York Times. How?
I think it has. I think in ways that are in ways that are small and in ways that are significant. I think in ways that are small is that journalists want to tell their stories differently. And it's been a gift to the news organization to be able to give people this whole new set of muscles to develop and flex, and ways to tell their story that are more narrative and that get to open themselves up and open up listeners to them. My colleague Julian Barnes recently wrote a story for which he will happily tell you he got a lot of criticism. It disclosed biographical details about the whistleblower in the impeachment inquiry, that he was a CIA officer, that he was and that he worked in the White House. And the story did not do that thorough a job of explaining why it was disclosing these details. He came on The Daily and told a very rich narrative of the effort by an associate of the whistleblower to first file a complaint within the CIA through their process. That eventually got squashed by the White House, and then the whistleblower turned to the more formal process. And as he told the story, it became clear why those details were really important, and also that the White House knew all those details anyway. And he'd gotten these really, really tough emails from readers, and one of them, after hearing The Daily, said, "I know I wrote you a really, really nasty email about your article, but now I better understand why you did what you did." Which was heartening. And I think that happens a lot with journalists. We get to take the thing they've already done and kind of reinvent it. And in the process, we kind of reinvent the way they're telling stories anyway. And so over time, I think it's all bleeding into one more transparent, more narrative-driven news organization. And I think that the other interesting sign is that first we had The Daily, and The Daily led to people at the Times wondering if we could do something similar in TV, and we created The Weekly, The Daily, The Weekly, the monthly, the yearly, and the Weekly is the medium's very different, so the show is different, but reporters are central characters. You're following them tell stories. You're learning who they are and what their process is, and it's helped people understand what journalism really takes, what it involves.
Favorite podcast that's not The Daily?
Favorite podcast that's not The Daily? So, I mean...
Besides The Stoop.
Besides the stoop, that should have been my line. Besides the stoop, I mean, I listen to many of the rival daily podcasts that have emerged.
What do you see as a rival?
I mean, you should never name your rivals, but there are a lot of daily shows that have emerged since the Daily started, and we think of this as an incredibly wonderful development because it means there are more producers, there's more audio talent, there's just a deeper pool of people doing this. So making the Daily is really hard. You know this, we talked about this. Making any audio is insanely hard. The amount of audio that has to be generated and in hours and manpower, womanpower, to create a 20 to 25 minute episode of the Daily is like, it would just knock your socks off. And the world needs more people who are capable of doing it. We're experiencing this revolution in digital audio and podcasting, and we need as much, talent as possible. So that's what's happening. But there's a kind of a lag actually. So it's really, really good. But I didn't answer your question. I'm dodging.
Bad interviewee.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to not talk about This American Life as the grandpapa, grandmama, the North Star for all of us. Because when I think about what makes the Daily special, it's the marriage of traditional old broadcast news with the narrative storytelling that everyone agrees, begins with Ira and that show. And so when the marriage of those two gave us shows like The Daily.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think my time is up, but I think we're going to go to some audience questions.
Now your time begins.
Now your time begins. So I think we're going to be going around.
We'll start up front here.
Thank you. I really appreciated hearing what you said about bringing more transparency. I think it's interesting as a first-class thing. I think it does what you say it does, which is help people understand the process that they should understand. There was an important thing that I wish I had heard you say.
What's that?
That I didn't hear you say, and I'm curious what your take on this would be. Often a role that transparency can play is bringing more participation in some way, or at least in some way improving the process. And you didn't say that you expected increased transparency about the process of journalism would improve the process, maybe
make it better.
Maybe improve fidelity of the meter or whatever it is, fix the W&B's thing, or there's a whole box of famous things that journalism has gotten wrong in my lifetime and many before my lifetime, and I would love to see some way that this transparency would help with that.
So I think that's an interesting question. Does the transparency make for better journalism? I think the answer is absolutely yes. So I apologize for not making that more clear. I think there's no world in which the journalism doesn't improve if the journalists are letting you more into their process and there's just more kind of mutual accountability to it. I think the example that I just talked about where maybe an article in its traditional form doesn't explain to you why we made certain decisions, and then we kind of wait for the blowback. And there were a lot of people who canceled their subscriptions. A lot, I don't know the numbers, but over that incident. And then a Daily episode comes out, and I think we are explaining to people what's happening, and I think that makes the whole process better. But look, social media has amplified everyone's ability to hold us accountable. I think that's powerful. But I also think that in this social media world, it sometimes seems as if the people on the other end of the Twitter accounts have forgotten that human fallibility applies to journalists as well. We make mistakes. We have to, and this is true on the right, and it is true on the left in terms of the anger that we witness. We make mistakes, and we have to own up to them. And I think there have been periods where the Times and other news organizations, but definitely the Times has not been as good about owning, just quickly responding to these moments. And I think we've all learned a lot of lessons about that stuff. But I continue to be a little surprised. I don't want to end this on a defensive note, so I'm trying to organize my answer correctly. But it can be painful to watch this crush come down on on my colleagues who I respect so much and I know work so hard when they just step a little bit, something happens. Something is slightly off. It happens. A headline is written by a busy copy editor, and people threaten to cancel the New York Times over it. That I have a hard time identifying with that, and yet I understand people's passions, and I understand their bond with the Times, and I respect all that, but I wish that like a greater level of empathy would kick in, because all of us know what it means, I hope, to make a mistake in our workplace. We make a mistake and everybody sees it or hears it, and it's really hard. But that doesn't make it right. It just means that I don't even know why I'm zeroing in on you. For all I know, you've never sent a mean tweet in your whole life. But if I can leave you with one bit of advice. Anyway.
Next question here on your left.
Hello.
Hello.
You talked about the surprise of the last election in 2016, and I know you're a reporter, so therefore you report on things that happened, but I'd be interested to know when you go to bed at night and you think about what could be the 2 or 3 surprises between now and or maybe that night that, go through your mind.
Do you mean between now and the next election?
Yes, between now and then.
I mean, I think elections are always full of surprises, and that's why they are such extraordinarily important things to cover really closely. I don't want to get macabre, but things happen to candidates you don't expect to happen, right? That have really significant consequences. Health issues happen. Family members get embroiled in scandals, whether it was Sarah Palin or in the case of Joe Biden, and so I don't make predictions about presidential campaigns because there's just no point. But the thing we talked about on the Daily was at the beginning when we had a big meeting of all of our editors and producers about what we wanted to make sure we didn't do this time around. We had a conversation about, if we get to the end of 2020 and Donald Trump is reelected, will we have covered the race in such a way that people will understand why that happened, and there will be some level of perhaps anticipation of it, or whatever word you want to use, almost like reverse engineer it. It's very easy for us to focus, the whole news world, to focus on a Democratic primary with all these clashing candidates and ideologies and sort of not properly pay attention to the president's reelection campaign. And I think that's one of the things we have to be really mindful of.
On your right.
So you talked about introducing fallibility and introducing the audience to the process and what it is like for a reporter to have to go in and get the story and get the information. My question for you is, where do you draw the line, and what are your philosophies on how much ideology and perspective and opinion do you introduce into a story? Because I feel like there used to be a clear delineation between reporting the facts and opinion. And now, at least in America, we blend those two things a lot. And it's what makes news interesting, is having a story and a narrative. But what's your philosophy, and how do you introduce your own personal opinions and the leaning of your institution to the stories that you report?
Well, I think I was zeroing in on some of the words you were using, and you used the word opinion and you used the word narrative. And I just want to tease those out a little bit, because no newsroom reporter at the Times comes on the Daily with a set of opinions, but they do come to the show with a set of kind of analytical judgments about the news. And those come from, in many cases, decades of beat reporting and analysis and perspective. And I do not believe those to be opinions so much as kind of earned understandings of what the news means, not what they think of the news. So, that's akin to, David Sanger wrote a piece that was on top of the website of the Times almost all day. And I don't think you would regard this as opinion, but I'd be interested in what you say. And that piece was about how many of the factors that led to the capture of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, I got it right for the show tomorrow, were factors that the president has largely soured on in his presidency. A certain approach to allies, a reliance on the Kurds, a strong relationship with the intelligence community, all that kind of stuff. And that is as far as we would go in our analysis on the show. I would say, David, we would tell the story that ends maybe with that big thought and have earned it through his narrative storytelling. I don't think that's an opinion so much as a hard-earned understanding of American foreign policy through David's 30 years of reporting. And I think that's where we draw the line. We're not interested in someone's opinion about the news. We have had these very interesting debates with our colleagues about how far to even take that news analysis sometimes. When it comes to impeachment, for example, when it comes to the Russia investigation, we got into a series of debates with our colleagues. It's hard to keep track. We got into a series of debates with our colleagues about what is collusion. And at a certain point, some of our colleagues were being very honest and say, there actually is no legal definition of collusion. And there is and there isn't. It's very complicated. So, I'm sorry, I got a little testy there. So, because we've had these debates. And so we would get into these very searching discussions, and we'd say, how far can we take this conversation on the air? Because let's be honest with people about what the law says versus what the political process might say versus what Mueller might say. And we didn't want anyone's opinion on it, but we definitely wanted them to explain to people that proving collusion might not prove a law had been broken or that it was going to lead to a legal consequence. And so that's where I think that, again, it's not opinion, it's analysis. And maybe I've given you too much of an answer, but we're not in the business of giving opinion. But you're so right that the rest of the news world, I think beyond the Times, and of course in our opinion section, which can confuse people, does give opinion. And that's okay as long as it's there's truth in advertising and branding. I think primetime cable news has gotten awfully confusing. 1 hour is news, the next hour is I don't know what that is. And then you march your way up to 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and it's just and so, and that's on the left, that's on the right. And so, and not that these two things are the same, because,
But this idea that she was talking about in terms of the reporter putting themselves into it.
Yeah, that's healthy.
What are the limits is what
I think the limits
heard.
are, we sort of know it when we hear it on the daily. That you've just gone a little too far. Or it may be that they know something that the listener doesn't know and they've said it a certain way, and we're not as comfortable with it. And so,
so it's more of a feeling than a set of rules.
It's a feel, yeah. And we're not in the business of, we are here to project the best possible version of storytelling at the New York Times, so I'm not going to pretend that we don't edit. We do edit. We make sure that we're telling stories that feel smart but also really fair.
Next question here on the left.
Actually, I wanted to follow up on that and your answer. I'm a great fan, and
Thank
I've
you.
written to you a couple times, but you haven't answered.
Did you write back?
No. But,
Now I will.
Maybe, I'll give you my email. A couple of examples where when I was frustrated because you didn't express an opinion or counteract something. For example, the coal miner who couldn't breathe on the show. It was a very moving show. I don't want to say it was one of my favorites because clearly he was nuts. Clean coal, and I'm not sick. And I kept waiting for you to say one thing, just one thing, because that was bullshit. And
so
you didn't.
What is your name? No, I want that.
Carol.
So you're referring to this is not by way of excuse. It was the first couple months of the show. We interviewed a coal miner, and we interviewed him because we wanted to understand the way a person who voted for President Trump and who was in the coal industry was thinking about the industry. And I happily admit that I got in a little over my skis on kind of coal, and the interview got very emotional because he turned the interview around on me and started asking me if I had been to a coal mine and what did I really know about coal, and coal had put his 4 kids through school, and Cole had, fed them, clothed them, and he was very proud, and I got very emotional, and I think it was something, it just had, who can explain the psychology of why an interview moves you? But I do recall feeling when I heard it the next day, and also from feedback, clearly from people like you, that we had not done a sufficient job in pushing back against at least 1 or 2 of the things he had said about Cole. And I think the early episodes and year or so of The Daily, we also did an interview with Scott Pruitt, which was another example of where we felt like he had kind of outwitted us in terms of the way he thought about and talked about his approach to policy. And so we had some interviews where I don't think we did as good a job as we should have in answering some of the points that you're making. And I'm happy to concede that.
We're going to take 2 more questions.
Got one on your right?
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Over the last 5-10 years, musicians have basically, they create music for free, we can access it, and then they kind of tour and create personalities around them to make money. I'm curious, is that where you see news going as well?
What do you mean?
Pod Save America, as another podcast, you're touring right now, the rise of cable news personalities. Is that where news is going? Is where you're going to have content being put out for free, and then the personalities behind that content kind of being the celebrities? Or
this is like the CNBC interview version of this. I mean, I think what you're asking is like, are you asking about the economic model of it, or kind of what happens to the people who?
Yes, I'm asking about the economic model behind it.
That's an interesting question. So, so The Daily started off as, and still is, a show with advertising in it, but of course we're part of the New York Times, but you get it for free. So it's this interesting kind of thing. There are people experimenting with subscription-based podcasts. That's really interesting. And we're not really sure where that's headed, but it seems, promising. But for the most part, not many people are getting really rich off podcasting. It's like, for the most, a few people, Spotify bought this company called Gimlet, and some people did get quite rich from that. But in general, you
do it because you love it.
You do it because you love it. Yeah, you do it because it's an incredibly powerful way to tell stories. And I don't identify entirely with this, the element of like the celebrities go off. I mean, the celebrities go off and they talk to people at JCCSF.
That's you.
Proudly.
All right, the last
One
question
more.
is here, all the way in the back.
Thank you. Hi, Michael. First of all, I want to say thank you. I'm here with my 12-year-old, and we listen to The Daily every morning on our ride to school.
Thank you.
Have so many conversations based on what we hear in the morning that lead us, particularly the ones that are multiple days worth.
Yep.
So thank you for that.
Thank you for listening.
Second, Maggie Haberman was in town a couple of weeks ago, and I got to see her in Berkeley. And going back to Trump, she talked quite a bit about not underestimating him, which I think a lot of us who are not Trump supporters frequently want to do, particularly when we see the tweets that come out each day. And one of the things that she said that really struck me is that he's incredibly smart, and not to underestimate that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Maggie is as close to infallible as a journalist can be. And I think she's right. I think, look, when I was reporting on Trump just from the very beginning and looking at his business, I was struck by how much he was kind of underestimated or parodied. And you go back and you look at some of the first buildings he built, including the Grand Hyatt, which was a very unique building with a glass wall in a moment where no one was doing that. He built really good buildings in the beginning. And he built important buildings in New York. I mean, Trump Tower, when it was built, was architecturally reviewed in a way where people thought it was just like really interesting and different. And his success, particularly in the first phase of his career was really significant. And you don't get to the place that he has gotten at many phases of his career without financial help from your father. That's a joke. But also with a real sense of vision and purpose, and just plowing through the universe and it's like making things happen. I remember some of the stories I've heard that I never even had a chance to publish of, trees coming into the atrium of Trump Tower, and there's still, if you go inside that tower, which is a massive atrium, there are these trees that are studded all along the kind of top of it, if you're looking up. And I remember hearing the story that the cranes came in and the trees were brought in, and Trump looked around and just said, "These are all the wrong height. I want them out of here." And millions of dollars later, the trees go out and they come back. The replacements come in, and this is a guy with a vision and a sense of how to promote himself and his vision and how to use his rhetoric and his words that was profoundly powerful. I mean, there were so many phases of the campaign where we thought, what is going on here? He is on stage talking about a ban on Muslims, and is that even legal? But time and again, he found a way to speak to a segment of voters that I don't think many of us were paying much attention to. And so there's no question in my mind that Maggie's right, that this is a person with a real set of talents that is maybe as unique a player in American life as there ever has been. And so, yeah, he's not to be underestimated.
Can we end on another kind of note? Anybody have
Did you want to ask one more question? Do you want to do one more question?
Please.
I'm so glad that so many New York Times people are coming to San Francisco.
I'm going to take one right
And
here.
Thank you.
Second, we have to end on a high.
No pressure. Record, I think that was a high. I think I ended on a high.
Hi.
Hi.
I just graduated college, and I think one
Congrats.
of the biggest, thank you. And I think one of the biggest things for me is The Daily brought news to my peers and people my age, and it made news something that was discussed, that was never discussed before. And I wanted to hear maybe what you think of this and your perspective on why The Daily has kind of recreated conversations around people who are early 20s.
I mean, I think, let me start with some bad marketing, kind of lingo, which is that your generation cares a lot about authenticity. I feel like Don Draper. But I think the reality is that that's true. And I think The Daily is, and not that we set out to target you, but the news as a form is kind of weird, right? It's cable talking at you, and there's graphics and scrolls, and there's newspaper stories that can feel really leaden and unrelatable. And I think podcasting as a form and The Daily as maybe one element of it have found a way to draw upon the news in a way that just feels different and more authentic and real and relatable and transparent and emotional. I mean, I think the thing that makes The Daily very special is how frequently at the end of an episode you feel things that you never expected to feel from a news story, and that may be sadness or a sense of revelation. It may be a deep kind of empathy or just surprise. And I think a lot of the traditional forms of journalism have a harder time doing those than audio. And I think that's what makes this all really special. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we have sat around the studio crying during the interviews. And then I feel, and I know because we get the emails from people, how powerfully the shows can move people who listen to them. And so that is very unique to this medium. You know this. And I think that's why, I hope that's why people like, you and your friends are connecting to it.
And we'll end with audio is king.
And queen.
And queen.
Yeah.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you
So
very
fun.
much. Very fun.
Thank you all.